So I guess it's becoming sort of a theme on this channel that I discuss, or better yet, deconstruct the hero worship myths of some of America's most revered political leaders. I did a video called Worst American Presidents, which I included Lincoln and FDR on that list, but since it still seems to be shocking to some people when I say things like FDR was a garbage president or Lincoln was a tyrant, I think it's useful to have videos that I can point to lay out my case exactly. In this video, I'll be discussing why I think our 32nd president was one of the worst we ever had, despite being viewed as a hero not just by progressives, but by a lot of conservatives in America today. And just like with Lincoln, the myth just does not stand up to the facts. FDR was born January 30th, 1882, in New York to a wealthy aristocratic father, and he would later go on to be the 32nd president of the United States. The Depression and FDR economics. Oh boy, this is a big one. So let's lay out a little bit of a backstory for what would become known as the Great Depression. In October of 1929, the stock market crashed. This was the first year of the Hoover administration, and essentially Hoover's entire term would be marked mainly by this oncoming depression. Just briefly, because it matters for clearing the record, Hoover was not, despite the popular narrative, he was not a laissez-faire non-interventionist, and you don't have to take my word for it. In Murray Rothbard's book, America's Great Depression, which is not only a fantastic read for anyone interested in the historical records of the event, but it's a great read because most of the book is addressed to absolutely curb-stomping the myth that Herbert Hoover was a do-nothing, hands-off, laissez-faire non-interventionist, covering every detail of the spending increases and the tariff and tax hikes imposed by the Hoover administration, which the chief economic advisor of FDR's 12-year presidency would say was the groundwork for the FDR administration's policies. Hoover basically started a lesser New Deal program prior to Roosevelt, which is funny when you take into account that FDR ran initially on attacking Hoover as being a big government spender. So basically the notion that Hoover was a laissez-faire guy and that it was the free market's fault for letting the Depression happen is nothing short of bullshit revisionist propaganda. Wikipedia has the Great Depression listed as starting in 1929 and ending in 1933, while some other outlets have the Depression listed as ending in 1939. But honestly, that's being far too kind and far too inaccurate. For one, if the Depression indeed ended in the spring of 33, as many outlets suggest, then the Depression would have ended before FDR even did anything, considering he wasn't inaugurated until March of 1933. Just for further reference, in 1933, the U.S. unemployment rate was 25%, so this idea just seems bizarre. It's sometimes said that the U.S. recovery began in the spring of 33, and that during the mid to the late 30s, output grew rapidly at an average rate of 9% a year between 33 and 37. The story not told in this account is that this did not show a booming economic recovery as much as it reflected the incredible new expansion of the money supply, decoupling of the dollar to gold, and the creation of new fiat currency. Unemployment didn't get out of the double digits until the 1940s. Even then, the economy didn't see anything that could be considered a real recovery until around 1946 or 47, when the federal budget was reduced tremendously after the end of World War II. This makes sense considering the government spending typically hinders the market by imposing restrictions and stealing resources from the productive aspects of the economy. In fact, by 1940, U.S. unemployment was still around 15%, and that means that after 7 years of FDR's New Deal programs, unemployment was still rampant. The unemployment numbers only dropped out of the double digits due to the involuntary servitude of the draft. So this myth just doesn't stand up to the facts. Not to mention that military service might make the employment numbers look better, but people joining the military doesn't make the productive aspects of the economy better. So how did FDR handle the Depression? Well, for starters, more and more people found themselves out of work and low on money. Monetary deflation occurs, meaning that the prices for the goods are dropping. This is good news for people with little money because more and more a little bit of money goes further and further. But FDR saw this as a bad thing. Why? Falling prices are great for buyers who are broke or have a little bit of money or are out of work due to the economic circumstances of the Depression, but falling prices also mean less money for the farmers and the crop harvesters. So in his first year of office, FDR signed the Agriculture Adjustment Act. This meant farmers would be paid by the government to not produce beyond a certain level of goods, or in some instances, they would be paid by the government to not produce anything at all. In doing so, the supply of these goods would be reduced, and the prices would rise back up. The government paid farmers to not only reduce supply, but to actually destroy insane amounts of goods already produced, such as crops and livestock. Millions of acres of cotton, corn, and wheat were leveled and destroyed. Piglets and hogs by the million were destroyed. Cattle, sheep, and other livestock were massacred en masse. Obviously, what you want at a time when everybody is starving and broke, right? Well, surprise, surprise, a lot of the farmers were more than happy to get paid by the government to comply with these new standards. But higher prices aren't great news for the average American who has just lost their job and has a family to feed, because these crops and the livestock weren't slaughtered and gifted to the poor and destitute. They weren't cut up and served to the needy as some sort of food for the poor program. They were destroyed entirely to boost prices and profits for industry leaders. Luckily, in 1936, the Supreme Court ruled that the Agricultural Adjustment Act was unconstitutional, but different versions of the act existed for another several decades later. FDR instituted the NIRA, which is the National Industry Recovery Act, which essentially cartelized most major industries at the coercion of the federal government. This means that the government granted these industry leaders a virtual monopoly on their industries in exchange for enacting collective bargaining rights, as well as wage and hour standards for their employees. This, too, was eventually struck down by the Supreme Court as being unconstitutional. The blocking of his unconstitutional measures is one of the reasons FDR sought to pack the Supreme Court with justices who would do his bidding. It's the hallmark of a tyrant who is furious that the Constitution was getting in the way of what he wanted to do. FDR expanded central government power to an extent never before seen in the United States. He had imposed programs for price fixing for various arenas of the market. The idea was centrally planned top-down price controlling in an attempt to restructure the economy. Via executive order, FDR created the OPA, or the Office of Price Administration, which placed price ceilings on most goods and rationed supplies. This meant everyday items like farm products, gas, and even food were strictly limited by the federal government to American citizens. Rent control was also introduced under these measures as well. FDR banned the private possession of gold under the guise that the people holding gold were selfish, greedy hoarders, and they faced legal prosecution. The only gold people were allowed to own were small things like wedding bands. He declared a bank holiday upon entering office, which shut down the American banking system for a week, meaning no one could remove their own money from their own accounts. He also created the FDIC, which insures banks against losses of money at the expense of the taxpayer and incentivizes unscrupulous behavior among banking firms. FDR also imposed the first minimum wage laws in the United States. His central planning of the economy during the 1940s froze wages for workers so no one could legally get a raise from their employer. Between this and the IRS granting tax incentives to businesses for providing health care to their employees is what led to the current system we have today of health care being tied to your employment. He also created the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration, which was a huge public works jobs program and one of the biggest programs of the New Deal era. These programs were largely inefficient and often referred to as boondoggling. The taxpayers were, for one, being extorted to pay for programs that could be accomplished more efficiently and cheaper by the private sector, in which the workers would have received better wages. And two, the taxpayers were being exploited to fund a program that largely benefited Democrats at the expense of Republicans. The WPA pulled workers away from the productive economic tasks being carried out by the market in the recovery phase of a depression. These are often the same critiques levied even today against government works programs. This all traces back to FDR and his executive overreach in the U.S. economy. FDR also implemented Social Security, which time has proven to be one of the biggest con jobs ever imposed on the American people. Imagine being forced to pay into a crappy pension plan ran by the most incompetent assholes in society that produces negative rates of return on your coerced investment. As for the war, there are a lot of questions that have to be asked. For starters, did FDR know about Pearl Harbor, or at least that the Japanese would commit an attack like Pearl Harbor? And did he just sit back and allow it to happen? This is often cited as a conspiracy theory, and honestly, I can't stake my life on this, but there are some very interesting pieces of evidence to note. 1. Just 3 days before the Pearl Harbor attack, Roosevelt was warned in a memo from Naval Intelligence that Tokyo's military and spy network were focusing heavily on Hawaii. 2. The McCollum memo from October 1940 was sent by Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum. The memorandum contains what was called the 8 Action Plan. The memo illustrates several people in the Office of Naval Intelligence promoted the idea of goading Japan into a war. Quote, "It is not believed that in the present state of political opinion the United States government is capable of declaring war against Japan without more ado. If by these 8 measures Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better." This isn't implied either, it's directly stated. It is not believed that in the present state of political opinion in the United States the government is capable of declaring war against Japan without more ado, and it is barely possible that vigorous action on our part might lead the Japanese to modify their attitude. Therefore, the following courses of action are suggested. The memo then goes on to state 8 specific points of action intended to provoke Japan into an attack on the U.S., which would then sway public opinion in support for U.S. military involvement in World War II. This isn't anything new for the U.S. government, considering Lincoln did something similar in 1861 to provoke the South Carolinians at Fort Sumter. The government has done similar things since World War II with the Gulf of Tonkin and Operation Northwoods. There's evidence that FDR read this memo and agreed with some, if not all of it. According to Robert Stinnett, who wrote the book Day of Deceit, Roosevelt said, "I just want to keep them popping up here and there and keep the Japs guessing. I don't mind losing 1 or 2 cruisers, but do not take a chance of losing 5 or 6. Admiral Kimmel, who was the commander of the Pacific Fleet, objected to this, saying that it was ill-advised and would result in war if we make this move. Third on my list is tensions between Japan and the U.S. weren't new, and FDR had seized all Japanese assets in July of 1941 and imposed an oil embargo on the Japanese in August. 4. FDR had been trying to get the U.S. involved in World War II for years. The U.S. had already been supplying the Allies involved in the European conflict for years. So no, I can't just dismiss all of this as a conspiracy theory. In other World War II American-era news, I almost forgot to mention that FDR interned 100,000 Japanese American citizens for the non-crime of having Japanese ancestry. 11,000 German Americans were also detained and questioned. Their constitutional rights meant absolutely nothing in this process, despite being full citizens of the country. In closing, I'll say this. FDR was an economically illiterate, government-expanding conman who attempted to centrally plan and muscle the U.S. economy and all the citizens. He further pushed the federal barrier and powers of the presidency beyond what even Lincoln had imagined, and even beyond what the horror known as Woodrow Wilson was even capable of. He's an incredibly overrated U.S. president, and it is this information that should be kept in mind anytime you hear the disciples of FDR utter their support for this man or his abhorrent, impractical, unethical, economically illiterate ideas. Roosevelt once famously said, quote, "The United States Constitution has proved itself the most marvelously elastic compilation of rules of government ever written." He was referring to the belief he had that the federal government would need to use more power in order to bring the country out of the Great Depression. He, however, actually prolonged it to the dismay and suffering of the American people. Well, that's all I have for you guys today. There's so much information to be discussed here, and I'm certainly open to being educated on any further issues or interesting things about FDR. The guy was America's only 4-term president, so there's a lot of horror to uncover in his policies, because popular don't mean right, for sure. But be sure to let me know your thoughts down below. If you guys have not seen my Lincoln Was a Tyrant video, be sure to check that one out. These people do not deserve the praises that are constantly heaped on them. But until next time, stay safe and live free.